So a question came in asking me to talk about autism and ADHD clients and what do we do with them? Not a lot, actually not a lot different to what I would do with anyone else. Now, I can't speak to the data, the research, and all the stuff that I should be talking about. I can only talk about my own personal experience and my own personal bias. Here's the thing. Back in the 70s and 80s, I grew up next to Cold East Hospital, which was a place where, at the time, I think they were called mentally handicapped people. There were other terms as well that abounded, and as time has gone on, terminologies change as it basically is deemed to be problematic or offensive in some way, and they change. And I don't know what the current term is. It's hard to keep up. Now, there's a large population there of people who needed supportive care. Some people were much more able than others, and some had much greater levels of disability than others. A lot of the people in places like this were labeled autistic. It was noticeable, it was visible. There is no ambiguity that there is some serious challenge going on with this person's neurology. Scroll forward to the late 1990s. And we start to see a shift in both social attitudes, but also institutional attitudes too. So there was much more involvement of community care, community support. The institutions were largely closed and people were moved out more into the community. It became normal for schools to start taking in children who would otherwise be institutionalized. There was a huge societal shift that happened. Now we scroll forward to the 2010s and into the 2020s. We now have perfectly healthy, normal, ordinary-looking people taking to their social media and in their bios and their profiles declaring themselves to be autistic, neurodivergent, ADHD, and so forth. Visibly, in watching and looking at the video output of some of these people, there's nothing visible to us that would say there's something wrong with this individual. They're suffering in a certain way. And indeed, some of them will come across as quite self-indulgent and quite narcissistic. Would that be the term? Essentially, what has occurred is a huge shift in what we think of as autism, what we think of as ADHD. Now, by moving the population who are largely marginalized from culture and society, from the institutions into mainstream culture and society, we also move the diagnostics. We also move the understanding of it. In delabeling those individuals, labeling lost its power in terms of marginalization. Now it's almost as if I put my pronouns and my neurodivergence diagnostics in my profile, it serves as an empowerment, as a qualification. Now, what I'm talking about here is what is visible to the observing person, i.e. myself. That in the people that I used to think of as autistic, there was something very, very visible. And undoubtedly, their challenges in life, their challenges with absolutely everything, there's a degree of dependency there. When I look at some of the people calling themselves autistic these days, I don't see anything. Now, is this to say that they don't have an internal structure of their experience of being self, of their experience in being in normal community, that they suffer challenges as a result? Quite probably they do. The question for me is, to what degree are those challenges something they can simply do something about with the right input, the right education, and the right stuff coming their way? And to what degree is labeling them and giving them further reinforcement of the diagnosis and then potentially low-level medications, to what degree is that boxing them in to a diagnostics, boxing them into a mindset, and boxing them into a way of being for the rest of their life? There's been an emergence in the last so many years, I've only really become aware of this in the last 10 years, probably less than that, of fully grown adults of my own age discovering their diagnostics. They're discovering their ADHD, their neurodivergence, their autism. They're discovering it, and it comes as an explanation for the kind of difficulties that they have struggled with socially all of their life. And yet, to all intents and purposes, these people are usually married or have been married. They have children. They're in full-time work. They are perfectly functional. They can go and buy food. They can have a home. They've got a mortgage. They have all of those trappings of societal success. They're not the people who, back in the 70s and 80s, we would have seen in institutions. At no point would they ever have been institutionalized. So I have to wonder, when people talk about autism and ADHD and other neurodivergence, what are they referring to? When I think of as autism, or what I think of as autism, does not match the current trend for people to say they have autism. Some people are just a bit odd. Some people had challenging child rearing. So when they were growing up, the challenges presented to them by the family left them social cripples. Lots of people suffer that. It's not an uncommon thing at all. Does that mean they're autistic because some of the symptomologies are the same? Or does it mean they didn't get the right educational input in their socializations? So this is where it becomes problematic, because there are many, many low-level subclinical manifestations of internal distress that may be signs of a neurological problem, but they may just be signs of poor development, poor educational input, and that the person can learn to do something about it. They're not learning disabled. Generally, those people who were discharged from the institutions were reframed from being handicapped to being learning disabled, which I always thought as being a little bit more pejorative, but that's just me. You're disabled from learning anything. I'm not entirely convinced that an awful lot of people I see with their adult manifestations of these disorders, where they haven't had clinical diagnostics for the last 40 years, I wonder to what degree are they learning disabled, or to what degree the diagnosis means they can be learning disabled, because I can't do anything about this because it's my diagnosis. So that's my general backdrop in how do I work with people? I don't do anything differently than anybody else. We've got to be realistic though. People's attention spans is shocking. I'm constantly amazed at how utterly inattentive people are generically. And I think social media, the doom scrolling, we've solved the problem of boredom, the endless screen time that people have, the disconnect from having to wait for things and just basically being stuck with your own thoughts. What do they call it? Raw dogging. When you're just not giving yourself stimulation, you're raw dogging. What on earth is going on? So modern life has damaged and crippled people's ability to pay attention to stuff. And the superficiality, the doom scroll, headline, video 6 seconds long, and so on, as opposed to having to sit down and pay attention for an hour at a time to work out what the plot line is. Even movies now, they're not built around the script and the storyline, they're built around the excitement, the flashes, the whizzes, the bangs, and all the action scenes, where there's a jump cut constantly every so many seconds. There's no fixed view anymore that the old movie stars used to have, because they would have fixed cameras, and often it was lengthy scenes being performed. People's attention span has been crippled. Does that mean that they have ADHD? Or ADD, or whatever, that we now have AuDHD, the autistic and hyperactivity disorder, the constant reinvention and amalgamation of different diagnostics? Or is it just the consequence of modern living? Now, the moment I start talking like this, I can imagine right now some people are looking at this and go, Austin, what the hell are you talking about? You don't know what you're talking about. I've suffered my entire life and I got my diagnosis at 57 years old, and it came as such a relief to finally understand. Yeah. There's something else going on there. Because with the diagnosis, what actually changes? Does the person start living differently? Do they go live in an institution? Do they change their job? Nothing changes for many people who get this adult diagnosis. But what changes is a perception of themselves. It's almost like the diagnosis allows them to have self-acceptance. But do we need a diagnosis to have self-acceptance? Surely they're not that learning disabled if a diagnosis brings relief. Relief can be brought in absence of what we call it. There was a while that everyone's calling themselves Asperger's. Nothing wrong with that. Oh, no, it doesn't exist anymore. Well, how can a disorder exist and then not exist? What about autism? Maybe we redefine that in the next diagnostic statistical manual. And then all those people who are categorized with it are no longer categorized, and we can include more people. But they won't actually exclude anyone. They'll just forever expand the diagnostic frameworks. So I think this is really the background of my thinking. The only thing I will do, though, with the inattentiveness that people present is I need to change the way I present stuff. I tend to witter on, if you noticed. I can talk about a thing and over and over and over. And sometimes I have to catch myself doing it and go, better stop talking about that now. With people with obvious inattentive issues, whether it is organic in them or it has been brought around by modern living, doesn't really matter because the surface symptoms in terms of communicating them will be the same thing. What I'm obviously going to do is shorten the session time, but also not overload them with information all in one go, which is my tendency. And I apologize for that for those who've struggled through some of my trainings. So sometimes I will adjust the styling of what I'm doing with an individual. But guess what? I would do that with anybody. It doesn't matter who's sitting in front of me. I'm going to adapt what I'm doing to fit in with their framework by which they have understanding, cognition, and so forth. We always meet the client at their model of the world. But what I won't do, because I'm not a diagnosing clinician, is reinforce people's diagnostics. But also when somebody says to me, I've got ADHD, I've got autism, I'm not going to go, oh no, you haven't. I'm not going to do that. That would be ridiculous, of course, because I'm not a diagnosing clinician. I'm just a therapist who tries to make suffering go away to the best I can. So I think that's all I've got to say on this. I will be interested in people's reactions or additions or other thoughts on this very modern phenomena that is occurring. Remember back in the 90s where there was resistance against medicating children, there was resistance against diagnosis, there was resistance against psychiatric framing. Psychiatry was very keen to push its boundaries and incorporate more people into these diagnostic frames, and the population kicked back. There was a huge anti-psychiatry movement. Now, psychiatry has evolved, as it would do, because it has science behind it. These days, we have the population diagnosing themselves, and the psychiatric industry is going, whoa, hang on, everybody. Maybe you don't have the diagnostics you think you do.